Well, good morning to each one. Good to see you on this beautiful Lord's Day morning. Jesse, if you could invite a few friends on your section, please. And Gil and Shannon, if you could do the same over there. We're a little slim pickings. Labor Day weekend, we got a lot of our members, obviously, who are away traveling. And be mindful of them, of course, for safety, but good to see those who are here with us. And we do have visitors, and we're especially thankful for you. We're in lesson 9 this morning in our study, focused on chapters 15, 16, and 17 of the book of Genesis. So if you want to have your Bibles open to Genesis 15, that would be a great place to be. And hopefully the regular class members, you have your Bob and Sandra Waldron book. That's a great workbook going along with our study in Genesis these last 2 quarters of the year. As you see, after today's study, we only have 3 more lessons left in this quarter, and then we're already going to be in the 4th and final quarter of the year. The year, as any year seems, goes by really quickly. We're already in September, but we look forward to the rest of these lessons and then moving further into the book of Genesis with Brother Todd Forrest leading that study in the 4th. All right, so again, each lesson and the lesson sheet tells us what we're focused on, the text, as well as the pages in the Waldron book that cover those chapters of Genesis. This morning, God's covenant with Abram, and so his name hasn't been changed quite yet. It's natural just to call him Abraham, but I'm still trying to stop short because he's still Abram. And then, of course, we had the birth of Ishmael in chapter 16, and then the covenant of circumcision there in chapter 17. So we got a lot of questions to get through, so we're going to try to move rather quickly if we can. But number 1, what significance, and this is chapter 15, opening verse there, what significance is seen in God's declaration that he is Abraham's shield and reward? What do you think is the significance of that? And let me give you a little hint, at least something I'm thinking about. One thing I would tie into this is what had just recently transpired. I know it's been a little while because we also had the good interruption with our gospel meeting, but think back 2 weeks ago, just look a little earlier in the text, what had just transpired back in chapter 14?
Abram had to rescue Lot because of these kings' conflicts from the north and the southern ones that rebelled. And so
right.
He has mighty men, and they were able to do that, but God's with them as well.
Yeah, you think back early on when God is communicating with Abram, how he says, I'm going to bless those who bless you, I'm going to curse those who curse you, I'm with you. And God certainly was with him. He goes into battle. And think about, you have all these kings that go up and rebel against the kings that are in the Mesopotamia area that came down, and after they stopped paying their fees, they came, and there's this great battle. And here's Abram with just 318 trained men, and he defeats them, and he rescues Lot, and he takes the possessions that they had taken and brings them back. And then what does Abram keep for himself of the spoils? Doesn't keep anything, does he? Now there's some men who go up with him and say they need to take what is theirs, but I'm not taking anything. So no one can say that we made Abraham rich. No, he knew God had blessed him. He knew God would continue to bless him. And so there's this reminder, I'm your shield, Abram. I'm your reward, right? You don't need the spoils from others. I'm your reward. And so don't be afraid. And here's this reassurance he receives. You have anything to add to that, Erica?
And to tie into all of that, it made me think of what Melchizedek had told Abraham, that God, because of God, he delivered him into Abraham's hand. And so kind of like what Clarissa was saying, even though he had, all of these mighty men,
Right.
It was actually God who delivered them.
Right. Okay, good. So you said what Melchizedek said? There in verses 19 and 20? Right. So when Melchizedek blessed the lesser, as the Hebrew writer will say, Abram, blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And gives the proper credit, glory, and praise to God as he blesses Abraham. So, way to appreciate you tying that in. Norm?
Like Bruce was talking about earlier in the week, Abram is still early in his process of building his faith, and it's kind of a great thing for us to remember as to how God is bringing him along here, and the importance of reminders, reinforcement. We tend to baptize people, and now you're on your own, and out you go, and that is the wrong approach. It's not God's approach. It's to be in a place where they can walk with you, and close enough that they can see it at least.
Yeah, we're tempted when we consider the Bible character Abraham to think of him right over here at kind of the end, when where he did not waver, instead of the journey. And that was a great lesson, I think Monday night, right? The journey of Abraham's faith. That it was a process of growth and maturity and dependence, but along the way, here's God strengthening him, reminding him, helping him. All right, anything else on number one you want to add? Okay, question 2, we're asking, although Abram trusted in God, what obstacle did he see to God fulfilling his promises? So, when you look at verse 2, after the Lord's declared to him, don't be afraid, I'm your shield, I'm your reward, your exceedingly great reward. What's Abram's response? Okay, you're my great reward, but I'm childless. What will you give me, seeing I go childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And look, you given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir. And so what did the Lord say? So here, the obstacle that he sees is, well, I'm childless still, right? And as I look in my household, the current heir is Eliezer of Damascus. And so how's the Lord respond to that?
From your own body shall be your heir.
He says, Abram, I want you to come out of the tent here. Come on outside, right? And that's kind of the picture we have with these questions. You go back to my opening chart. Well, that's kind of, I need to take away my text, but the point is, here's a sky filled with stars, and we come to verses 4 and 5, and the Lord said, this one shall not be your heir, not Eliezer of Damascus. And as Shirley just said, one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. Notice he hasn't yet revealed specifically Sarai. But one is going to come from your own body. Then he brought him outside and he said, look now toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. I'm childless right now. Don't have a son. Go outside, Abram, and look up in the sky. Look in the night sky. And you can imagine, and we have it here, even though all the things that we've built, you can get out away from the city and the lights and out in the country, and we can see those magnificent skies explode on clear nights with the stars, right? And remind yourself on those occasions. Go outside and think about this story. And what was Abram's response according to the text? He believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness. All right. Go ahead, Nora.
One of the scariest time is when you are, starting out on a journey, when you can't see past the next curve in the road or can't see over the next hill. And that's where Abram was, at this point. And again, interesting how he's as God's bringing him along, he's just bringing him along step by step. You mentioned about, it's coming from your body. It's going to be coming from your body. You can see now how Abram could make a mistake later on. Well, this, Hagar, this might be a good idea. And when you're up close to something, any obstacle, it looks tall. When you're laying on the floor and you can't see past the chair that's standing next to you, even though the chair's only 3 feet off the floor. Those are the things that he's dealing with at this point.
Yeah. Okay, Erica?
I thought it was interesting between the translations. So in the ESV, I think it kind of, and I think the ASV is the same, but I think it kind of gives a little bit more clarification to why Abraham asked God, what will you give me? Because in those translations it says that God told him, I am your shield and you will have a great reward. So he doesn't say, I am your reward. He says, you will have a great reward. And so you see Abraham immediately jump to an heir. And so I thought that was interesting. But to me, this question also shows Abraham's faith, because God had already told him he was going to have a great nation come from him. And so you see Abraham tying that together. So the question is still showing his faith, but asking God, how are you going to do this?
Sure.
So I just thought those two, like the difference in the translations, kind of helped bring a little bit more light to the situation.
Right. Yeah, I know you promised this back here. I'm childless still. There's nothing wrong with asking God questions, right? Especially based on information He's already given us. And so, tying in what the text says there in verse 5 or verse 6, compare Genesis chapter 15, verse 6 with Romans 4:3 and 9 and 22, Galatians 3:6 and James 2:23. In other words, these are other times that we find this statement about Abraham. He believed in the Lord and He counted it to him for righteousness. And so when we look at those various usages of that by Paul and by James in the New Testament, what do we come away with? Norm?
Well, God was asking Abraham to do something when he asked him the question, what will you give me? And he gives him this example, and God is in telling him what He's telling him is asking him to believe what it is that He's telling him, and that action is an active thing. And Abram comes back to him with the thing that God is asked for, which is, here's the step. Do you believe the step? Yes, I believe that step. And so it's the action of belief here that is being talked about. He's actually responding to something that God is asking him to do, and he's responding positively.
All right. Yeah, that's something, again, going back to Bruce's lesson, that he kind of spent some time on this statement, and that it's kind of a summary of what Abraham did, not just mental assent and no action on his part. No, he had a faith that was active. Yes, he believed, and yes, he trusted in God, but how did he express that belief and trust by action? And so one of the things that the Waldrons have from their material, it says Romans 4:3 and Galatians 3:6, the point is that Abraham was righteous because he believed God, not because he was perfect in his works. And of course, Bruce, going back to his lesson, was making a point about what works are we talking about there in Romans, works of the law. James 2:23, what's the context there? Because he mentions works, but he's dealing with a different kind of works than Paul was. And that's why it's always important when works are mentioned, it's not just always one kind of works, right? There's the works of God, there's the works of the devil, in fact, the Bible speaks of. There's the works of the law of Moses, there's the works of human merit that we read about, not of yourselves, lest you should boast, Ephesians 2, 8 and 9. But then there's the works of God, what God instructs us to do. For example, in John 6:29, faith is called, belief in His Son that He sent is called a work of God. And so you always got to look at the context. What kind of works are we talking about? So here in James 2, beginning in verse 14 down to the end of the chapter, verse 26, what kind of works is James talking about? Well, clearly he's not talking about the works of the devil, and he's not talking about the works of the law of Moses. He's not talking about the works of human merit. We're going to do a bunch of things and earn our salvation. He's talking about an obedient faith. He's talking about the works of God, what God instructs us to do. And he's certainly contrasting not just saying and not doing, right? And so he begins with the brother or sister who is in need of food and clothing, and what you do is you just speak words. Be warmed and filled, and you send them on their way, but you don't take action, you don't do anything, you just talk, you just say. He brings up the demons, right? In verse 19 of James 2. Even the demons believe in God and they tremble, but what? Well, they're still demons. They don't change. And so, yeah, there's a belief there, but not an obedient belief or faith. And so faith without works, these kind of works that James talking about, it's dead. And then he gets into Abraham and he gets into Rahab towards the end of that section and the end of the chapter as shining examples of the kind of faith that pleases God. It's not just a person that says, yeah, I believe you, God, and then goes on his merry way, thinks it, says it, but lives it and does it, and Abraham did and Rahab did. And so that's the kind of faith that we must possess. And in that context, we find this Genesis 15:6 again, quoted by James, how he believed in the Lord and he counted to him for righteousness. And what has James tied that statement into? What story in Abraham's life? What event in his life? Francis?
The sacrifice of Isaac.
Exactly. Which, that's to come later in our study, Genesis 22. But when he's called upon by God to offer up, I'm childless, we're studying here in chapter 15. Well, eventually he gets that child, Isaac, and now he's told to go offer Isaac, his only begotten son, as a sacrifice to God. And he goes out to do it, doesn't he? Because what did he conclude? The Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews 11, well, God allows me to go through with this because of His promise. Then he concluded God's going to raise him up, going to bring him back to life, right? And so it's interesting to look at how this statement from Genesis 15:6, how Abraham believed in the Lord and He accounted it to him for righteousness, is found in various places in the New Testament. But again, when you look at the whole picture of Abraham, it's never just, okay, I believe in you, God, and I don't do anything. Or I tell others I believe in God and I don't live my life in that way to reflect it. No, he had an active, obedient trust and faith in God. Francis?
So when Isaac asked where was the sacrifice, he answered, God will provide.
That's right, God will provide. Now, Abraham didn't know exactly how, but there's that trust and that obedience in God, right? Okay, Jesse?
I'll tie this to chapter 26 because he says the same thing there, verses 4 and 5, that I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven and give them all these lands, and in your seed the nations of the world should be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So he really defines what that just faith and belief was.
Yeah, so that was Genesis 26, and then you're moving into his son Isaac and the story of Isaac and Abimelech there later. But as Jesse just referenced, if you didn't hear him, verses 4 and 5, the Lord said to Isaac, and I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of the heaven. Doesn't that sound familiar? Genesis 15, right? Good tie-in, Jesse. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And so we just got all three of them right there again, didn't we? Nation, land, seed. Verse 5, here's the reason. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. And that obedience of Abraham is emphasized in other places, but that's really concise and compacted there. Great place to go. Thanks for that reference. All right, anyone else? Okay, going to question 4, verses 7 through 21 of Genesis 15. They repeat the land promise. To further assure Abram that he would fulfill his promise, what did the Lord do? What did the Lord do?
Established a covenant with him with the dead animals and the fire pot and the flaming torch.
Yeah, that's an interesting text, isn't it? It's a very, almost seems very, very peculiar to us. But it's interesting the way that a covenant was made in ancient times and what God does here. And so after we read that statement we were dealing with in verse 6, how Abram still believed in the Lord and he counted to him for righteousness, he said to him, God did, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur the Chaldeans. There's another reminder, it wasn't Haran, it was Ur when he received his initial call from God, to give you this land to inherit. And he said, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? So you remember he said, how will I know? Because I'm childless. Come outside. How will I know my descendants will inherit this land? And so he says, do this, right? And bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And God instructs him what to do with those animals. Again, having the Waldron book will give you some added material on this text. I think that is helpful. But the Lord entered into a covenant with Abraham. This way of making a covenant was prevalent among many ancient nations. It's interesting, the Hebrew word translated make a covenant means literally to cut a covenant. And that's exactly what he does with these animals, right? To cut a covenant, referring to the cutting of the animals. And I'm going to read from the Waldron book on page 62 at the top left corner, if you have that. The word for covenant, berith, comes from a word which means to eat and reflects the practice of the parties to a covenant eating together after passing between the cut pieces of the animal or animals. This method is alluded to by Jeremiah in the case of Israel at Mount Sinai in Jeremiah 34, verse 18. Here in Abram's day, the normal pattern of both passing between the pieces was not followed because only God did so. This difference is because although there were two parties, as in all covenants, in this covenant that God was making, Abram did not stand on equality with God. God extends the agreement to man as a benefit of his grace. You think of two men or two nations going into a covenant with one another. This is, of course, completely different. It's God and man, and so he extends his mercy, extends his grace. But interesting there, to make a covenant literally means to cut a covenant. And what do we see? If animals are involved and they're being cut, what's involved here? Blood. Blood's being shed, right? Something the Hebrew writer will pick up on there in Hebrews 9, that without shedding of blood, there is no remission. But with the first covenant, there was bloodshed. With the second covenant, Jesus' covenant, there's blood that had to be shed, his. But here, God making a covenant and blood being shed. Okay? And going back to Noah and what we studied there, after him coming out of the ark and God making a covenant. Well, weren't animals offered then at that time? Okay. Anything you want to add to this? Okay. Number 5, still here in chapter 15, verses 12 through 16. List the significant features of God's revelation to Abram here in verses 12 through 16. What does he reveal to Abram? Well in advance of their fulfillment.
Being in a foreign land, being oppressed, and that they will be freed and plunder it, and then go and take the land that's been promised, which is exactly what happens.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's God, so he knows all things, of course, but here we are in the same chapter, I'm childless, and God's already talking about the descendants that are going to come from him, that are going to be later in this other land, Egypt, as strangers, and how they're going to serve the people of the land. They would be there about 400 years, and God's going to judge that nation, of course, the plagues upon the Egyptians, and God would bring them out, and God's going to bring them out with much substance, and it's going to be so long before that all happens, and here Isaac's not even there yet, and God's talking about all that because of his close relationship, no doubt, with Abram and what he's promised him, but he gives Abram and he gives us insight into the future events that will transpire with those that will come from him. Okay? Moving into chapter 16, question 6, what was the civil custom befallen when a wife was barren? So when you go to the beginning of chapter 16, here's Abram and Sarai and still no children. And so now Sarai, Abram's wife, verse 1, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Okay, and then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And then we have this helpful timeline mentioned here at the end of verse 3. And Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. Well, how old was he when he came to Canaan? We go back to Genesis 12. He was about 75, we read there. So now he's about 85. Right, at this point in time in the land of Canaan. So 10 years have passed from Genesis 12, those verses, to here in chapter 16, a decade of time. Now, again, this sounds so weird and weird's not the right word, or adjective, but anyways, what was the civil custom to be followed when a wife was barren? Yeah, so I think the Waldrons maybe have this material. It was a day of multiple wives, or as this would be, a wife plus a concubine. If the wife could not have children, and this was a common way of providing an heir. And it had been 10 years since Abram had entered the land of promise, so he agreed to Sarai's suggestions and took Hagar for a concubine. Now, Merrill F. Unger, in his book, Archaeology in the Old Testament, on page 122, says Nuzu, this is N-U-Z-U, so I may not be pronouncing it right, but Nuzu marital customs illustrate Sarah's action in giving her Egyptian servant Hagar to her husband as her substitute when she despaired of being a mother herself. Nuzu marriage regulations stipulate that if a wife is barren, she must furnish her husband with a slave wife. Whew. Okay. Well, I don't know. I'm not the expert. Maybe Merrill F. Unger is, and that's what he recorded. And other books I read, they seem, that was the ancient civil custom. But, that worked out real well, didn't it? Clarissa?
I mean, also, in this day and age, there are women or couples that are unable to have children, and there's not as big a stigma necessarily with that. There are maybe even treatments that could get them there, or adoption, like just in this custom. But back then, it was definitely a stigma. The way you grew, the way you were blessed, the power that you had was through growing a family. So it is very odd to us, but back then, it was just a way of trying to maintain growth and your blessings and all that comes from that. Maybe is my thought on that.
Well, it was huge. It was a huge deal. Think of the various situations or families we know of in the Old and New Testament where the wife was barren, and whether later it was Hannah, and that story was Samuel and how that went, or whether it was John's parents, Zechariah and Elizabeth. But back here in this time, in the ancient times, it was a custom. Now I'm going to move on. Although this was an accepted custom of that day, why was this plan of Sarai and Abram still wrong? And what were the consequences? And what should we learn from this story?
Pretty clear that it was going to come from them, and they're seeking to help that situation is not necessary. And then that only led to conflict and strife and hurt and anger, and then there's Ishmael that they have to deal with as far as God dealing with that group of people that arise.
Does God ever help and bring about His will? Sometimes we sing a hymn in His time. Well, that doesn't match up with my time and what I want, and this needs to happen. And it's been 10 years, and so we can become impatient and not wait on the Lord and the fulfillment of His will. And so, it didn't show a lack of faith and trust in God and confidence in His plan unfolding in His time. And it was as if they thought they must help God fulfill His promise that He made to Abram. And then what transpires right after this? Well, Hagar is with child through Sarai's husband, something that Sarai hasn't been able to do all these years. She's able to do pretty much right away. And what does Hagar do? Pretty foolish on her part, but starts needling her mistress, Sarai, right? And so you got this strife between Sarai and Hagar, and she despised Sarai, and Sarai then treats her harshly, and she ends up fleeing for a period of time. What should we learn from this story? Well, obviously, don't share your spouse with anyone, but I'm thinking beyond that. I'm not going back to the ancient custom, right? We don't practice that, but what do you think is maybe some application for us? We need to what? Try to help God. There's something repeated over and over in the Old Testament, the Psalms in particular, about the importance of waiting on the Lord. We can be very impatient, right? I can relate to that. We can be very impatient people. And yet, one of the things that we're instructed to be is persevering people. People that are patient, like the prophets and like Job. And God's going to keep His promises, and God's going to fulfill His will in His time. And so wait on the Lord. Don't try to help the Lord. He'll carry out His will. Anything you might want to add? Okay, Norm?
Well, just that God obviously was testing, He'd been testing Abram all along. And here's an opportunity to test Sarah and give her an opportunity to learn some things from making bad decisions. And obviously God, can use it in whatever circumstances that we tend to make with our own decisions to make His will come about. I mean, all of those 10 tribes that come from Ishmael, those folks, that's as a result of disobedience. But God wanted those folks to be there, and they're there as a thorn in the side of the Israelites from that point on.
Right. Okay, so what promises were made to Hagar regarding Ishmael, and what became of Ishmael's descendants? So the Genesis 25 reference, that's for the second question. But here in chapter 16, she flees, right? She flees and she goes, let's see, the angel of the Lord found her, verse 7, by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. Ask her, why'd you come here? Where'd you come from? I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress, Sarai. But what promises are made here to her?
His descendants.
Yeah, you're going to bear a son. Read there in verses 11 and 12, right? You should call his name Ishmael, because the Lord is what? The Lord has heard of your affliction. And what does the name Ishmael mean? Okay. God hears, literally God hears, right? And what kind of person shall he be? He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, every man's hand against him. Well, that don't sound too good. But, and then looking forward into Genesis chapter 25, it's stated there that 12 princes, according to their nations, are going to come from him. And they dwelt, we're told where they dwelt, from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt, as you go toward Assyria. What people's connected to Ishmael? These 12 princes, and this wild man, and his hand going to be against everybody, every man's hand going to be against him. What people come from him? That's right, the Arabs. Okay. And number 9, what important truth about God are we reminded of through this incident with Hagar? How does she refer to God here? And she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees, Hebrew El-Roi. And so the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. So what's the significance here? And how can we apply it maybe to ourselves?
Here's us.
God sees us and hears us in our affliction, doesn't he? He's not a God that is far off and disconnected from us, even though it might seem that way. He's not. He's near us. He knows us. He knows what we're going through. He's a God that cares. 1 Peter 5:7, that we're to cast all our cares or anxieties upon. And even Hagar realizes that. This is a God who sees me, that hears and sees my affliction. Well, that certainly hasn't changed through Christ now in our relationship with God, has it? All right, so we need to come into chapter 17 real quick, as we'll just have a few minutes remaining. Why did the Lord appear to Abram as God Almighty?
Child would come from Sarah.
Okay. You think about that term, God Almighty. In other words, I am fully able to perform all I have promised you. I am the one who's more than strong enough to do whatever it takes to accomplish my will, no matter how impossible it may seem to men. And so, yes, to reassure Abram and strengthen his faith and what God would fulfill through him and by him. Okay. Question 11, what is the significance of God changing Abram and Sarai's names? And then who would be some of the nations and kings that would come from them? So what's the significance of changing their names? We see this a lot in the Old Testament, right? We see it a little bit in the New Testament, but particularly in the Old Testament, God giving a specific name to a person.
States that specifically Abraham was now going to be a father of nations. And then you see Sarah, he doesn't specifically say why, but it's right before she gives birth with Isaac. So she's now the mother, she's going to be the future mother of these nations.
All right. Yeah, Abraham's a little more clear. Abraham, exalted father now, exalted father of many nations, right? So Abraham, multitude, because I made you the father of many nations. Sarah and Sarah seem to be very closely related, but princess, by all nations. But this change of their names, it reflects God's promises that He's made to them, right? And as we think about some of the nations and kings that would come from them, obviously we can think of Israel. That's going to come from Abraham, but you got the Edomites and the Ishmaelites and the Amalekites and the Kenzites and the Midianites and the Assyrians, and then you think about the kings and who's going to come through them. Eventually you think about the tribe of Judah, don't we? You think about David and all the kings and that lineage of Judah, but eventually the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, right? And then question 12, what alternate plan does Abraham, now I can say Abraham, I can stop saying Abram, good. Does Abraham suggest to God, and why, and in what ways did God reveal His plan in more detail here? So what does Abraham suggest? Yeah, so when you get to verses 17 through 22, he makes mention of, what about Ishmael? Ishmael, why don't we just go with Ishmael? And to carry out your promises. Why? Because I'm like about 100 years old. And Sarah's almost 90 at this point in time, right? I mean, we're old. And people aren't living like Methuselah anymore, right? I mean, they're going to live for a while longer, but, and she's been barren all these years. You've blessed us with Ishmael. Let's just go with Ishmael. No. God gets very specific now about His plans and what He reveals, and He says what? No, Sarah's going to bear you a son, and his name is going to be Isaac, and Sarah shall bear to him at this set time next year. Oh, we're a year out now, all right? That's very specific. No, it's going to be Sarah and you, and you're going to have a son, and his name's going to be Isaac, and it's going to be about a year from now. Well, that was the second bell, but for what purpose did God command Abraham and his descendants to be circumcised? How does this passage demonstrate Abraham's faith, and in what way does circumcision still apply to us today? So we don't have time for that. We're going to put that at the very beginning of our class next week, okay? Thank you all.